The Great Depression was the worst economic crisis in all of American history. It lasted approximately 12 years from 1929 with the stock market crash until 1941 when the U.S. entered World War II. So, the presidency of Herbert Hoover, well, he was in office when the Depression started, and he had won a landslide victory in the election of 1928. The economy had been booming for the past decade under the leadership of Republicans, and since he was a Republican, people wanted to continue what they believed to be the result of Republican economic policies. And then, only 7 months after Hoover became president in October 1929, disaster struck. The stock market crashed. Hoover attempted to fix the free-falling economy, but failed to do so in everything that he tried, and things continued to get worse and worse throughout the remainder of his one term as president. So why did the stock market crash? Well, there were a few economic trends that were increasing throughout the 1920s. First off, you have the inflated prices of stock shares. You have companies misleading the shareholders by inflating their prices artificially, making them seem more valuable than they actually were, which bought people to buy more stocks than they could truly afford. Then you have the overproduction of consumer goods. Remember, in the 1920s, you have increased consumerism, mass production, materialism, and you have an overproduction of consumer goods that eventually could not be sold because there was just too much of it, and then that caused an economic collapse. You also have the overexpansion of consumer credit. About 60% of all cars were purchased on credit, and a lot of people were not able to pay back the things that they purchased on credit, which caused people to lose a lot of money. And then fourth, you have the purchase of stocks on credit, which is buying on margin. So you have people buying stocks for more than they were truly worth with money that they didn't actually have. And all of this is very unsustainable. Eventually, this bubble burst in October 1929. People lost millions of dollars in the stock market. People then rushed to the banks to get their money, and the banks had to close down. So you have the stock market crash combined with the run on the banks. That meant whether you had your money in the stock market or in the banks, it's likely that you were losing it all in a matter of days here. So the positive economic cycle of the 1920s completely reversed. And over the next 4 years, it just got worse and worse and worse. Unemployment got worse. You have more runs on banks taking place throughout the early 1930s. And people suffered in a way in America that they had never suffered before. So the stock market crash is what started the Great Depression. And President Hoover, while the crash was not his fault, he really did not have any answers as to how to fix it. But it doesn't mean he didn't try. From 1929 to 1932, Hoover attempted to resolve the Depression by setting government regulations. He said, we have to do something in order to try to reverse this depression. So the first thing he did was he signed a tariff act called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, and this raised tariffs on imports, taxes on imports. And the logic behind this said that if we raise tariffs on imports, we'll have more money coming into our country. Well, unfortunately, that's not what happened. Since tariffs were raised, other countries that were also experiencing a depression, this was a global depression, they decided to cut their trades with the United States. Other countries could no longer afford to trade with the U.S., and so this cut Americans' trade industry in half and even worsened the Depression. The next thing Herbert Hoover tried was tax increases on the wealthy. This can seem like a very logical thing, right? I mean, the wealthy can afford tax increases, so let's tax them. However, by raising taxes on the wealthy from 25% to 63%, what happened was that the wealthy people could no longer create jobs anymore. It is the wealthy who create jobs. Therefore, since they had so much of their money going away in taxes, they had to lay off workers. They couldn't create businesses anymore. And so unemployment rose, prices rose, and businesses went under. So the Depression continued to get worse for the rest of Hoover's time in office. Just to show how drastically things had changed, the U.S. unemployment rate before the stock market crash in 1929 was 3%. That's about as good as it can possibly get. Then by 1933, it had skyrocketed to 25%. That means 25% of people of working age, this isn't counting children or retirees, 25% of people who need a job cannot find a job. So this led to breadlines in America. It led to people not having enough to eat, not having enough money to pay for clothes. They had to move out of their houses, all sorts of ways that Americans suffered tremendously. So you have millions of Americans losing their life savings in the stock market crash, either in the stock market or in the banks in the coming years. Then millions of people lost their jobs because employers could no longer afford to pay them. Millions of people lost their homes then because they were unable to pay their mortgage or their rent. And people could no longer afford enough food for their families. So hunger and malnutrition became a very serious problem in America for the first time in a very long time. People could no longer afford clothes, so most wore rags that didn't really keep them warm in the winter, not to mention the drafty houses and homes, shacks that they had to construct that didn't really keep the cold wind out. Here are a couple of heartbreaking photos from the time of the Great Depression. On the left, you see a home that had to be constructed because the family could no longer afford to live in their house. And you can see the kind of clothes they're wearing. The child has no shoes. They're all living in one room, dirt floors probably. And then the one on the right is called Migrant Mother. And there's a very famous picture from the days of the Great Depression where you can just see the anguish on her face because she doesn't know how she's going to provide for her children. This is what was called a shanty town. These were the basically vacant lots, dirt lots that were filled by people who couldn't live in their house anymore, who had to foreclose on their homes or were kicked out of their apartments because they couldn't pay the rent anymore. They just had to build these shacks out of corrugated steel and cardboard and wooden planks, and they all kind of packed in together in these slums. So, understandably, whenever a crisis happens, people blame whoever is in charge. They blame the leader. Whether he deserves it or not, the leader is blamed during a time of crisis. And remember, Herbert Hoover had won in a landslide in 1928. If you look at that map there, he pretty much won every state except for the Deep South and Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But then, 4 years later, he's no longer popular. He's the most hated man in America because everyone blames him for this horrible depression. So in the 1932 election, when Hoover runs for re-election, the electoral map goes from this to this, where he only wins a handful of states in the Northeast, and the rest of the country votes for Democrat Franklin D. Roosevelt, because they said we need someone new. We need some party that's different than the party who was in charge during this economic downfall. So Franklin D. Roosevelt, or FDR, also believed in strong government intervention, but he disagreed with Hoover on the details of exactly how involved government should be and what specifically it should do to try to alleviate economic hardships. FDR's plan to fix the economy was known as the New Deal, and this included the creation of dozens of government programs, all with the intention of providing America with what he called the 3 R's: relief, recovery, and reform. Relief from the economic hardships that they were experiencing, recovery, like recovering your homes and your jobs from what you lost, and reform, meaning reforming the economic system so that something like this would never happen again. And this would hopefully get the U.S. out of the Depression. So the New Deal had dozens of pieces to it. So it's difficult to say that the New Deal was all good or all bad because you had so many different government programs that made up what was called the New Deal. So to put it simply, part of the New Deal was good. Some programs were very good, others were very harmful. So let's start talking about the harmful ones. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA. And this was really the centerpiece of FDR's economic plan, the centerpiece of the New Deal. And what the NIRA did was it set government regulations demanding higher wages and higher prices, wage and price control. And the logic behind this, that FDR and his brain trust of smart economic guys said, what they said would happen, was that if you make businesses pay their people more, then people would have more money. And then if you raised prices, then businesses would make more money. So they thought that this would lead to greater employment and greater prosperity. Unfortunately, the opposite happened. This led to companies having to lay off workers. If you force a company to raise the wages of their employees, then oftentimes that means they can't afford to hire as many employees, and so people are going to get laid off. So this actually prolonged the Depression. Also, by setting prices higher, that means that goods were no longer affordable for the poorest U.S. citizens. So this was seen as government overreach. Not only did it not work, but it was ruled by the Supreme Court to actually be unconstitutional. In 1935, the Supreme Court said that it was not constitutional, that the government does not have the power to tell businesses how much they have to pay their workers or what they should raise their prices to, and therefore it was dissolved by the Supreme Court 2 years after it started. Nonetheless, FDR was very convinced that this was the way forward, and if just given enough time, wage and price controls could truly reform this country economically. So he supported and helped pass the Wagner Act of 1935, and this kind of went around the Supreme Court's ruling on the NIRA and wage and price controls, and it continued to artificially inflate both wages and prices, which continued to prolong the Depression. And it's very possible that without these two New Deal policies, the Depression would have ended sooner. But the New Deal had some really good parts too, some good parts that still affect America positively to this day. For example, you have the FDIC. This is the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Then you also have the SEC, which is the Securities and Exchange Commission. So an issue that FDR was trying to solve with the creation of these two transformative government programs was people's lack of trust in financial institutions. Once the stock market crashed, people stopped trusting the stock market, and therefore they stopped putting their money in the stock market, and that did nothing to help the economy recover. Similarly, after the banks failed, and people lost money in the banks that they thought were safe, people stopped putting their money in the banks, and that did nothing to help the banks recover and the economy to recover. So FDR said we need to restore people's trust in the stock market and in the banks. So what are we going to do? Well, let's start with the banks. The FDIC, Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, reformed the banks to make people's money more secure, all right? So what it did was it said that all the money you put into the bank, up to $250,000, is guaranteed by the federal government. So that even if that bank goes bankrupt, you will still get the amount of money you put into the bank because the government will cut you a check. So this made people start putting their money into the banks again, which helped them rebound. Then you have the Securities and Exchange Commission, and this reformed the stock market to make it more trustworthy and dependable. So while it's still risky to put your money in the stock market, it's more of a measured risk because the SEC makes sure that companies are being truthful about the value of their stock shares. They look out for companies misleading the shareholders like had been done in the 1920s. And both of these programs restored public confidence in these financial institutions, caused people to start saving and investing again, and this really helped the economy to slowly start to recover. Now, unfortunately, racial discrimination continued in the 1930s with devastating effects on African Americans because they were often the last people hired and the first people fired if layoffs had to happen. The national employment rate peaked at 25% in 1933, as we said, but it was even higher for African Americans. And oftentimes, despite their extreme poverty, jobless African Americans were excluded from both state and local relief programs. Hard times tend to increase racial tensions. Racial tensions worsened during the 1930s, particularly in the South, where lynchings continued. And civil rights leaders could get very little support from President Franklin D. Roosevelt because at this time, the Democratic Party was still largely run, or at least half run, by white Southerners, white supremacists. And FDR feared that if he helped black people too much, he would lose his support in the South, where the Democratic Party's grip on Southern voters was so strong. He did not want to alienate those voters and lose those votes. So he did not do as much as he could have to help African Americans. However, the New Deal did provide some relief for black people who found jobs with federal programs. And even though they did find jobs with the New Deal, unfortunately, these were low-paying jobs and often segregated. So the New Deal did provide some help to African Americans, though not as much as it could have. But since it did provide some help, FDR continued to win election after election with large black support. African Americans also received moral support from First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. For example, in 1939, the famous black singer Marian Anderson had been refused the use of Constitution Hall in D.C. She was going to sing a concert there, but then the all-white organization, Daughters of the American Revolution, the DAR, they said, no, we're going to cancel your event because we're not going to have a black entertainer here. Eleanor Roosevelt then responded to that by arranging for Marian Anderson to give a special concert at the Lincoln Memorial, which you see in the picture there. Over 100 African Americans were appointed to middle-level positions in the federal government by FDR. You also have a woman, Mary McLeod Bethune. She established the Federal Council on Negro Affairs for the purpose of increasing black involvement in the New Deal, and that worked very well. Then in 1941, FDR set up a committee to assist minorities in gaining jobs for specifically defense industries because we had just entered World War II. Now, FDR, while he did do the right thing, he did this only after prominent black leader A. Philip Randolph had threatened a march on Washington to demand equal job opportunities for black citizens if he didn't. So he responded to that pressure by doing the right thing. The Dust Bowl was one of the most tragic parts of the Great Depression. This really compounded the suffering of people who lived in the Southern Plains. It was a 10-year-long drought in the Southern Plains. If you look at the map at the above, the area in the pink, and especially the area in the brown, is the place that experienced the Dust Bowl the worst. So you have 10 years of basically no rain whatsoever, and therefore, with no rains, the crops can't grow, and so farmers are losing money and not making any profit from their harvests every year because there's nothing to harvest. And yet every spring they would go back and plow up their fields, confident that this year the rains would come. Well, unfortunately, rains did not come, but what did come were high winds, these massive gales and gusts of wind, and because of the dry looseness of the soil that was always being replowed every spring, you had these huge dust storms. You have tons and tons of dust being swept across the plains, and this created a huge catastrophe because you have houses being buried, you have people not able to breathe, you have cattle dying in the field because their lungs fill up with dust, you have a dramatic decrease in America's food supply, and this ruined the lives of thousands of farmers. Many died from inhaling the dust, many more died from the destruction of their crops and their cattle, and those who didn't die oftentimes moved to the cities, moved away from the plains to try to find work that oftentimes was not there, and so they had to live in the slums that some people called Hoovervilles because they still blamed Hoover for all of this suffering. Now, the event that finally ended the Great Depression for the U.S. in 1941 was, ironically, the attack on Pearl Harbor. While that day was certainly a tragedy, a day which will live in infamy, our entrance into World War II created an economic boom because the war led to higher employment. Now, all of a sudden, there's a need for people to enlist in the military, so now men have jobs. There's also a huge need for factory work to make weapons and ships and bullets and things like that. So you have millions of people getting factory jobs, and now unemployment is way low, production is high, prices are low again, and now the Depression, which had been going on for 12 years and only improving slightly over the past 8 years, was brought to an end.